How are you keeping production going, especially since in some places like Newport News, you have had employees who have tested positive for COVID?
Right. Well, thanks for that. We right away recognized that the first thing we had to do to keep our employees safe was to give them flexibility to make the choices that were happening. That their lives were going to be disrupted. The schools were closing. Family members were losing their jobs in other places. So we needed to make sure that they had plenty of flexibility. So we quickly implemented two protocols. One was a liberal leave policy for folks to not have their absences count against them in terms of their employment. We basically told everybody that whenever this gets to the other side, you still have a job with us, and you have latitude to maneuver to manage the situation in your life. The second thing we did, though, was we absolutely changed our posture on remote working. We went from literally a very small percentage of folks who were working remotely to now about 25% of the corporation is working remotely, and that's been a very dramatic change in the way that we're doing the business. And then the next thing we did was we connected. I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So the other thing we did was we connected with the CDC to make sure that we stayed at least in step with where the CDC protocols were going to be for working in an environment where people had to work together. We identified places in our business where you can do shipbuilding, but you don't have to work standing next to somebody else. And we've seen this in other manufacturers too, where there's a lot of open space. There's a lot of ways to reset the work so that people are not working on top of each other. And then in those particular cases where 2 or 3 people have to work really close together, we stepped up the way we thought about those jobs, and we gave the folks the opportunity to, like they always had, but we reinforced the idea to raise your hand if you're not comfortable, and let's rethink this until we get to a place where everybody's comfortable doing the work. So this balance between the safe environment and the flexibility is how we're getting through it.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear you talk about 25% of the workforce working from home, working remotely right now. That's certainly significant. For that other 75%, though, that is showing up at shipyards like Newport News, which is where you make the nuclear submarines and the nuclear-powered aircraft carriers, and where, as I mentioned at the top of this interview, there have been cases of COVID confirmed among some of your staffers. How do you keep the morale up? And how do you grapple with what I imagine is a very hard decision on whether to keep operations open or to potentially close them?
Well, the first part of it is to continue to be aggressive in terms of our safety protocols. Continue to look for ways to be even more safe than we were yesterday. The challenge for us is that we had about 9 days from the time that we stood up our crisis team to get prepared for this until we had our first positive case. And I think that our recognition from the very beginning is closure is not really an option for us, because there's not going to be, in my opinion, there's not going to be a scenario until we get a vaccine. There's not going to be a scenario where we're going to have no positive cases in the communities where we do work. So we have to go figure out how we're going to do work where we have positive test results in the community and even in the workforce. And so from the very beginning, we've said this is for the long run. Let's make sure that we continue to evolve and innovate and find ways to work our way through that. And that's the way we've approached it.
And then, of course, there's the supply chain, which is very much in focus as well. When it comes to shipbuilding, it is somewhat of a tenuous chain. I know it's something you and I have spoken about before in the past. It has sometimes been an issue, even in the good times, because there are just so many businesses, many of them small businesses. And in some cases, you're talking about suppliers that are the only ones that can make certain types of components. How are you working with those businesses right now? Are they able to stay open and continue producing for you? And what has that process been like?
Well, I first of all, let me just say, I think the Pentagon deserves a lot of credit. And in particular, the Navy was kind of at the forefront of this, recognizing at the very beginning that not only are we critical infrastructure, but we also need to be healthy to go through this. And liquidity was going to be a big issue, maybe not for a company like us so much, but for a lot of our thousands of suppliers. They were going to be faced with that, like a lot of small businesses. And so they actually made a lot of changes to the way their payment rules. And the commitment on the part of primes like us is that we're going to pass those changes in payments rules to our supply chain. And what that's allowed us to do is we've actually been able to flow cash to our suppliers, especially our small and disadvantaged businesses. We've really been able to support them because there has been a change in the way that the government's thinking about how they pay. And what that does is, as you and I have talked about before, we have several thousand suppliers in virtually every state. And so we're actually putting funding into each of those local communities, I would say at least as fast as any other sort of liquid sources could come relative to the work that they're doing. That we're just able to support, I'd say about 2/3 of our small and disadvantaged businesses last month in the invoices that we paid. We paid about 2/3 of that money was prepayments, if you will, for work that's going forward. So it's been real economic. That's a very important part of our mission here right now.